Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a warm evening. The sun is just beginning to set, casting everything in that soft golden light. There's a glass in your hand, deep ruby or maybe pale gold, and the scent rising from it is something ancient, something alive. Something that took years, even decades, to become what it is right now. Wine is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever told. It stretches back thousands of years, woven through celebrations and ceremonies, through art and agriculture, through heartbreak and joy. Every bottle carries with it a piece of the earth it came from, the hands that tended it, and the time that shaped it. Over the course of this video, we're going to take a slow, peaceful journey through 100 fascinating facts about wine, its history, its science, its quirks, and its beauty. There's no rush. Settle in. Pour yourself something you love. Let's begin. The ancient roots of wine. Wine is one of the oldest alcoholic beverages ever created by human hands. The earliest confirmed evidence of winemaking dates back approximately 8,000 years to the region of what is now the country of Georgia in the South Caucasus. Archaeologists discovered ancient clay jars called kvevari, large, egg-shaped vessels buried in the ground, that still bore the chemical residue of fermented grapes. 8,000 years. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 3,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was even built. The wild grape species responsible for nearly all the wine we drink today is called Vitis vinifera. It originated in the same Caucasus region where those ancient jars were found, the borderlands between modern Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. From that one corner of the world, this single species of grape eventually spread westward across Europe, eastward into Asia, and ultimately, through exploration and colonization, to every wine-producing continent on Earth. Almost everything in your glass, whether it's a French Bordeaux, a Californian Cabernet, or an Argentine Malbec, traces its genetic roots back to that same ancient wild vine. The ancient Egyptians were passionate wine lovers, though wine in their culture was largely reserved for royalty, priests, and the elite. They were also remarkably advanced about it. They developed what some historians consider the world's first wine labeling system. Amphorae, the clay jars used to store wine, were sometimes stamped or inscribed with information about the vintage year, the vineyard of origin, and even the name of the winemaker. It's a system that wouldn't look entirely out of place on a modern wine bottle. Ancient Greece gave wine a god. Dionysus, known as Bacchus in Roman mythology, was the deity of wine, festivity, and ecstatic experience. But beyond mythology, the Greeks were serious viticulturalists. They carried grapevines with them as they colonized the Mediterranean coastline, planting vineyards in what are now southern France, Italy, and Spain. In fact, some of the wine regions we consider quintessentially French or Italian today owe their very existence to Greek settlers who arrived over 2,500 years ago. The Romans took everything the Greeks started and turned it into an empire, including wine culture. Rome spread viticulture across an enormous swath of Europe, planting vineyards in regions that would one day become legendary: Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhine Valley, the Moselle. Roman soldiers were given a daily ration of wine called posca, though it was typically quite sour and heavily diluted with water. Wine wasn't just a drink in the Roman world, it was a form of currency, a diplomatic tool, and a symbol of civilization itself. Roman writers left behind some of the earliest detailed accounts of which wines were considered the finest, and some of those ancient regions are still producing exceptional wine today. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it was the Christian Church that quietly kept European winemaking alive. Monasteries across France, Germany, and Italy became centers of viticultural knowledge. Monks had time, resources, and generations of accumulated wisdom, and they needed wine for the Eucharist, which gave the craft a sacred purpose. The famous Burgundy wine region of France was largely shaped by Cistercian monks during the Middle Ages. They were remarkably meticulous, observing how the soil differed from one plot of land to the next, how the vines behaved on a slight slope versus a flat field. In doing so, they laid the foundations for the concept of terroir, the French idea that the land itself has a distinct personality that expresses itself in the wine. Speaking of terroir, The word itself comes from the French word for earth or land, and it has no perfect translation in English. It encompasses not just the soil, but the climate, the slope of the hillside, the amount of rainfall, the direction of the wind, even the microorganisms living in the ground beneath the vine. Winemakers and sommeliers often speak about terroir as a kind of fingerprint, the idea that a wine grown in one specific spot cannot truly be replicated anywhere else in the world, no matter how carefully you try. It's one of the most poetic concepts in all of agriculture. There are believed to be somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 distinct varieties of wine grape in the world. The exact number is difficult to pin down because many are known by different names in different regions, and others are so rare they exist only in a single vineyard or family's private garden. Of that vast number, only a few hundred are commercially cultivated, and just a handful dominate global production. Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Syrah, these are the names you see most often. But behind them lies an extraordinary world of obscure, ancient, and wonderfully strange varieties that most people will never encounter. Cabernet Sauvignon, arguably the most recognized red wine grape in the world, is actually a relatively young variety, at least by wine standards. DNA analysis published in 1997 revealed that it was born from an accidental cross-pollination between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc, two grapes that had been grown side by side in the Bordeaux region of France. That spontaneous union likely occurred sometime in the 17th century. For a grape that now produces some of the most expensive and celebrated bottles on earth, its origins are surprisingly humble, a chance encounter between two plants in a French vineyard centuries ago. The world of wine didn't begin in a chateau or a wine cellar. It began in the earth, in wild vines climbing through forests, in ancient hands pressing fruit into clay jars, in monks walking their vineyards at dawn. Everything that comes after is built on that long, patient foundation. And we're only just getting started. The science of the vine. There's something almost miraculous about the fact that wine exists at all. It requires no human invention at its core, just grapes, time, and the invisible work of nature. But the more you understand about what's actually happening inside the vine, inside the grape, and inside the bottle, the more remarkable the whole process becomes. A grapevine is one of the most resilient plants in the agricultural world, but what makes it extraordinary is that stress, in the right amounts, actually improves the quality of its fruit. When a vine has to struggle for water, when its roots push deep through rocky or poor soil searching for nutrients, the vine redirects its energy away from producing large quantities of grapes and toward producing fewer, more concentrated ones. The sugars, acids, and flavor compounds inside each berry become more intense. This is why some of the world's most celebrated vineyards sit on land that looks, at first glance, completely inhospitable: steep hillsides, thin chalky soil, ancient riverbed gravel. A comfortable, well-watered vine often produces dull wine. A vine that has had to work for its life produces something extraordinary. Grapevines are also remarkably long-lived. Most agricultural crops are replanted every few years, but a well-tended grapevine can live for well over a century, and some of the oldest vines in the world are genuinely ancient. In the town of Maribor in Slovenia, there is a vine believed to be over 400 years old that is still producing grapes. It's recognized by the Guinness World Records as the oldest known living grapevine. In Australia and California, you can find so-called old vine Zinfandel and Grenache that were planted in the 1800s and are still bearing fruit today. As vines age, they naturally produce fewer grapes, but the depth and complexity of flavor those grapes carry tends to increase with every passing decade. The transformation of grape juice into wine comes down to a single biological process: fermentation. It sounds simple, but what's actually happening is extraordinary. Yeast, tiny single-celled fungi, consume the natural sugars in the grape juice and convert them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This process generates heat, it bubbles and churns, and over the course of days or weeks, something that was sweet fruit juice becomes wine. What makes it endlessly fascinating is that different strains of yeast produce subtly different flavors and aromas. Some winemakers use commercially cultivated yeast strains for consistency and predictability. Others rely entirely on the wild, naturally occurring yeasts that live on the grape skins and in the air of the winery itself, a practice sometimes called wild fermentation or natural fermentation. The result can be unpredictable, surprising, and deeply expressive of a specific place. The color of a wine doesn't come from the juice of the grape itself, it comes from the skins. Almost all grape juice, regardless of whether it comes from a red or white variety, is actually colorless or very pale. The deep ruby of a red wine is the result of a process called maceration, where the grape skins are left in contact with the juice during fermentation. The color compounds, called anthocyanins, gradually leach out of the skins and into the liquid. This is also why you can make a white wine from a red grape, as long as the skins are removed quickly before they have a chance to tint the juice. Champagne, for example, is often made partly or entirely from Pinot Noir, a red grape, but because the skins are removed almost immediately, the wine remains pale and golden. Tannins are one of the most talked about elements in wine, and yet many people aren't entirely sure what they actually are. Tannins are naturally occurring compounds, polyphenols, found primarily in the skins, seeds, and stems of grapes, as well as in oak wood. When you taste a wine and feel that drying, slightly grippy sensation along the inside of your cheeks and gums, that's tannin at work. It binds to proteins in your saliva, reducing lubrication, which is why a tannic red wine pairs so beautifully with a rich, fatty steak. The fat and protein in the meat essentially neutralize the tannin, softening the wine and making both the food and the drink taste better together. Tannins also act as natural preservatives, which is one of the reasons that full-bodied, tannic red wines tend to age so much better than lighter styles. Acidity is the quiet backbone of every great wine, and it's one of the most important factors determining how long a wine will age. Acids in wine, primarily tartaric, malic, and citric acid, give it freshness, lift, and structure. They're the reason a sip of wine makes your mouth water. In warm climates, grapes ripen quickly and their natural acidity drops, producing rounder, softer wines. In cool climates, grapes ripen slowly and retain more of their acidity, creating wines with more tension and nerve. This is why cool climate regions like Burgundy, the Loire Valley, and Germany consistently produce wines with extraordinary aging potential. That high natural acidity acts like a preservative, allowing the wine to evolve gracefully in the bottle for years, sometimes decades, before it reaches its peak. Oak barrels are one of the most powerful tools a winemaker has, and the relationship between wine and oak is a surprisingly complex one. When wine is aged in an oak barrel, several things happen simultaneously. The wine slowly absorbs compounds from the wood itself, adding flavors of vanilla, spice, toast, and cedar. A small amount of oxygen seeps through the porous wood, gently softening the wine's tannins and helping it develop more complexity. And some of the wine itself slowly evaporates through the barrel walls, a loss that winemakers, with a certain poetic generosity, call the angel's share. The size of the barrel matters enormously. Smaller barrels impart more oak flavor more quickly, while larger barrels offer a slower, subtler influence. Some winemakers age their wine in brand new oak for maximum flavor impact. Others prefer barrels that have already been used several times and are largely neutral, letting the grape itself speak without any wooden interruption. Sulfites, or sulfur dioxide, appear on nearly every wine label in the world, and they have a reputation that's somewhat unfair. Many people blame them for headaches and hangovers, but the evidence linking sulfites to headaches is actually quite thin. Sulfites are a naturally occurring byproduct of fermentation, meaning every wine contains some amount of them regardless of whether any is added. Winemakers have used added sulfur as a preservative for centuries. The ancient Romans used to burn sulfur candles inside empty wine vessels to sterilize them. In modern winemaking, sulfites prevent oxidation and inhibit unwanted bacterial growth, helping wine stay fresh and stable. Dried fruits like apricots and raisins actually contain far higher concentrations of sulfites than almost any wine, yet rarely get the same blame. The more likely culprits behind wine headaches are histamines, dehydration, and simply drinking too much. There is a phenomenon in winemaking known as Brett, short for Brettanomyces, a genus of wild yeast that can find its way into a winery and take up residence in the barrels, the walls, even the floors. In small amounts, Brett produces complex, interesting aromas, a slight earthiness, leather, smoke, even a hint of spice. Many wine lovers actually appreciate a whisper of it in certain styles of wine, particularly older Burgundies and traditional Bordeaux. But in larger quantities, Brett becomes a fault, producing aromas variously described as barnyard, wet horse, or band-aid. The line between a charming quirk and a ruinous flaw is a fine one, and it's a source of endless debate among winemakers, critics, and enthusiasts. Some love it. Some despise it. Nearly all of them find it fascinating. From the roots of an ancient vine pushing through stony ground, to the wild yeasts drifting through the air of a cellar, to the slow chemistry happening inside a darkened barrel, wine is, at its heart, a living thing. It breathes. It changes. It surprises. And understanding even a little of the science behind it somehow makes each sip feel that much more alive. The great wine regions of the world. If wine is a living thing shaped by the earth it comes from, then the regions of the world where it's made are its birthplaces, each one with its own personality, its own rhythm, its own particular relationship between sky and soil and vine. We could spend a lifetime exploring them all. But let's take a slow, unhurried journey through some of the most fascinating corners of the winemaking world and discover what makes each one unlike anywhere else on earth. France is, by almost any measure, the country that has had the greatest influence on the modern world of wine. Not necessarily because French wines are always the best, that's a conversation for another day, but because France established the language, the philosophy, and the benchmark standards that the entire industry still uses. The concept of appellation, the legally defined geographical origin of a wine, was pioneered by France and has since been adopted by wine regions all over the world. France's great regions read like a map of history: Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, the Rhône Valley, the Loire Valley, Alsace. Each one produces wines so distinctive that they could never be mistaken for one another, even though they exist within the same country's borders. France didn't just make wine. It made the framework through which the whole world learned to think about wine. Burgundy, in eastern France, is perhaps the most intellectually fascinating wine region on earth, and also one of the most humbling. It produces wine from just two grape varieties, Pinot Noir for reds and Chardonnay for whites. That's it. And yet within those two grapes, across a stretch of hillside barely 60 kilometers long, it produces wines of such staggering variety and complexity that wine lovers spend entire lifetimes trying to understand them. The reason lies in the obsessive precision with which Burgundy has been mapped. Its vineyards are divided into thousands of individual plots called climate, each one recognized as producing wine with a distinct and unrepeatable character. Some of the most celebrated and expensive bottles in the world come from plots no bigger than a large garden. Italy rivals France in the sheer breadth and depth of its wine culture, and in one important respect, it actually surpasses it: variety. Italy is home to an estimated 2,000 or more indigenous grape varieties, more than any other country on earth. Many of these are grown in just one region, one valley, sometimes one single village. Italy's winemaking geography is extraordinarily complex. 20 distinct wine regions, each with its own traditions, its own grape varieties, its own food culture. From the elegant Nebbiolo-based wines of Piedmont in the north, to the volcanic Nerello Mascalese growing on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily, Italy is less a single wine country and more a collection of dozens of distinct wine worlds existing side by side. Spain holds a record that surprises most people. It has more land planted with grapevines than any other country in the world. More than France, more than Italy, somewhere in the region of 1 million hectares of vineyards. And yet Spain produces less total wine than both of those countries, because much of its vineyard land is so arid and the vines are planted so sparsely, with so much dry earth between each one, that overall yields are quite low. The result of all that space and struggle is what we talked about earlier: concentrated, characterful grapes, grown by vines that have had to work hard in difficult conditions. Spain's great wine regions range from the elegant, age-worthy Tempranillos of Rioja to the mineral-edged whites of Rías Baixas on the Atlantic coast, each shaped entirely by the particular landscape it inhabits. Germany produces some of the most misunderstood wines in the world. For decades, its reputation in many export markets was defined by cheap, sweet wines sold in tall bottles. But behind that reputation lies something else entirely, a tradition of producing some of the most complex, long-lived, and extraordinary white wines on the planet. German Riesling, grown in steep vineyards along the Rhine and Moselle rivers, is capable of aging for 30, 40, even 50 years, developing layers of flavor that few other white wines in the world can match. The best German wines balance sweetness with a piercing, electric acidity that keeps them vibrant and alive for decades. Many of the world's most respected sommeliers and winemakers consider aged German Riesling to be among the greatest wines ever produced, anywhere, by anyone. The story of wine in the Americas begins not with the famous regions of California or Argentina, but considerably further north and east, with the Spanish missionaries who carried vines into Mexico and South America in the 16th century. In what is now Argentina, winemaking was established in the mid-1500s. But the grape variety that would eventually make Argentina world famous arrived much later, and by accident. Malbec, a grape that had been largely marginalized in its native Bordeaux, prone to disease and difficult to grow in the French climate, was brought to Argentina in the mid-1800s. In the high-altitude Mendoza region, under intense Andean sunlight and surrounded by some of the world's most dramatic mountain scenery, Malbec found conditions it seemed to have been waiting for its entire existence. It flourished. Today, Argentina produces Malbec of a richness and depth that often surpasses anything the grape ever managed in France. California's wine industry has a history stretching back to the Spanish missions of the 18th century, but the moment that truly changed its place in the world came on a single day in Paris in 1976. A British wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier organized a blind tasting, now known simply as the Judgment of Paris, in which French judges compared top Bordeaux and Burgundy wines against California wines of the same styles. The results stunned the wine world. California wines topped both the red and white categories. The French judges, not realizing they'd voted for the Californian bottles, were reportedly dismayed. The tasting single-handedly shattered the assumption that great wine could only come from Europe, and opened the door for wine regions from Australia to South Africa to New Zealand to be taken seriously on the world stage. New Zealand's wine story is one of the most rapid and dramatic transformations in the history of the industry. As recently as the 1970s, it was a country with almost no international wine reputation at all. Then, in the early 1980s, a handful of pioneering producers planted Sauvignon Blanc in the Marlborough region at the northern tip of the South Island, a cool, sun-drenched valley with stony soils and a climate unlike anywhere else on Earth. The resulting wines were startling, explosively aromatic, vivid with the sense of fresh herbs, passion fruit, and citrus, with a brightness and intensity that no Sauvignon Blanc from anywhere else in the world had ever quite achieved. Within 2 decades, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc had become one of the most recognizable and sought-after wine styles on the planet. An industry essentially built itself from scratch in the span of a generation. South Africa's wine history stretches back to 1659, when the Dutch East India Company first produced wine at the Cape of Good Hope, making it one of the oldest wine industries in the New World. But the country's most distinctive contribution to global wine culture is a grape that exists virtually nowhere else, Pinot Noir. Created in 1925 by a South African scientist named Abraham Isaac Perold, Pinot Noir is a cross between Pinot Noir and Cinsault, and it produces wines of a character that is utterly unique, smoky, earthy, richly fruited, and deeply expressive of the dramatic African landscape. It divides opinion sharply among wine lovers. Some find it thrilling, others find it challenging, but that polarizing quality is itself a testament to how genuinely original it is. In a world where so many wines increasingly taste alike, Pinot Noir tastes like nowhere else but home. Every wine region on Earth is a conversation between a place and its history, shaped by the people who first planted vines there, by the discoveries and accidents that followed, and by the particular stubbornness of a landscape that refuses to be replicated anywhere else. Whether it's a riverbank in Germany, a hillside in Burgundy, or a sun-baked plain at the foot of the Andes, every great wine region tells you something true about the world. And there are so many more still to discover. The art of tasting, what your glass is really telling you. There's a difference between drinking wine and tasting it. Drinking is easy, and there's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes a glass of wine is simply a pleasure to be enjoyed without analysis or ceremony. But tasting, really tasting, is something else entirely. It's a slow act of attention. A conversation between your senses and what's in the glass. And once you begin to understand what you're looking for, every single pour becomes a small adventure. The human nose is capable of detecting somewhere between 1 trillion and 10 trillion distinct scents. The estimates vary depending on the study, but the number is almost incomprehensibly large. This is why smell is considered the most important sense in wine tasting, far more significant than taste itself. What we experience as flavor when we drink wine is actually a combination of the basic tastes detected on the tongue: sweetness, acidity, bitterness, saltiness, and an enormous range of aromatic compounds that travel up through the back of the throat to the olfactory receptors. Swirling wine in a glass isn't an affectation, it genuinely helps. The movement agitates the wine, releasing more volatile aromatic compounds into the air above the glass, making the wine's bouquet more accessible and expressive to the nose. Wine contains hundreds, in some cases over 1,000, distinct aromatic compounds, and they come from 3 separate sources that sommeliers and winemakers think about quite differently. The first source is the grape itself, the natural fruit, floral, and herbal aromas that come directly from the variety. These are called primary aromas. The second source is fermentation. The yeasts and bacteria that transform juice into wine also create their own aromatic byproducts. Bread, cream, mushroom, and nutty notes can all emerge from this stage. These are secondary aromas. The third source is time, the slow transformation that happens as a wine ages, either in barrel or in bottle. The complex, evolved aromas that develop over years, dried fruits, leather, tobacco, forest floor, truffles, are called tertiary aromas, and together they form what is known as the wine's bouquet. Learning to identify which aromas belong to which category is one of the quiet joys of becoming more fluent in wine. The shape of a wine glass matters far more than most people realize, and not for reasons of pretension. The bowl of a wine glass is designed to concentrate aromas toward the nose, which is why wine glasses are always wider in the middle and narrower at the rim. Different grape varieties and wine styles genuinely benefit from different glass shapes. A large, wide-bowled glass for Burgundy-style Pinot Noir allows the wine's delicate and complex aromas to gather and bloom before reaching the nose. A narrower, taller glass for Riesling or Champagne preserves the wine's natural effervescence and acidity. The Austrian glassware company Riedel famously pioneered the idea that different grape varieties deserved different glasses, and conducted blind tastings in the 1970s and 80s to demonstrate the point. The wine world was skeptical at first. Then it tasted the difference for itself. Temperature has a profound effect on how a wine tastes, and most wines are served at the wrong temperature far more often than they're served correctly. Red wines are widely assumed to be served at room temperature, but that guideline dates from an era when rooms in European stone buildings were considerably cooler than the centrally heated homes and restaurants of today. A full-bodied red wine served too warm will taste flat and alcoholic, its subtleties lost in a kind of shapeless warmth. Most reds are best served somewhere between 15 and 18 degrees Celsius, noticeably cool to the touch. White wines, meanwhile, are often served too cold, which mutes their aromas and suppresses their flavors. A fine white Burgundy or aged Riesling served straight from a very cold fridge is essentially muffled. Give it 10 minutes in the glass and it will begin to open up and reveal itself. Champagne is the one style that genuinely benefits from being served quite cold, which helps preserve its bubbles and its refreshing, lively character. The concept of a wine being corked refers to a specific and genuinely unpleasant fault caused by a compound called TCA, trichloroanisole, which can form when natural cork reacts with certain chlorine-based compounds. A corked wine smells musty, damp, and closed-in, often compared to wet cardboard or a damp cellar. It doesn't make the wine dangerous to drink, but it strips it entirely of its fruit and character, leaving something flat and unpleasant in their place. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 3 and 7% of all wines sealed with natural cork are affected to some degree. This is the primary reason that screw caps and synthetic closures have become increasingly common, particularly for wines intended to be drunk young. Some winemakers in traditional regions still resist the change for cultural reasons. The ritual of opening a cork has a romance that a screw cap simply can't replicate. But the argument is difficult to maintain when one bottle in 20 is quietly ruined before it's even opened. Decanting, pouring wine from its bottle into a separate glass vessel before serving, serves two distinct purposes that are often confused with one another. For older red wines, the primary reason to decant is to separate the wine from any sediment that has accumulated in the bottle over years of aging. Pouring carefully, with a light source behind the bottle, allows the winemaker to stop before the sediment reaches the neck. But for younger wines, particularly young reds with firm tannins, decanting serves a completely different purpose. It exposes the wine to oxygen, allowing it to breathe and open up, softening tannins and encouraging aromas to emerge that might otherwise take hours or years to develop in a sealed bottle. A young, tight, tannic Cabernet Sauvignon decanted for 2 hours before dinner can taste remarkably different from the same wine poured directly from the bottle. Wine and food pairing is one of those subjects that can seem intimidating and rule-bound, but at its heart it rests on a handful of elegant principles that, once understood, make instinctive sense. The most fundamental is the idea of balance. Neither the wine nor the food should overwhelm the other. A delicate, lightly flavored fish dish paired with a bold, tannic red wine will make both suffer. The wine will crush the fish, and the food will make the wine taste harsh and aggressive. Beyond balance, there's the principle of contrast, a rich, creamy dish cut by a high-acid wine, each making the other more vivid. And there's the principle of harmony, matching regional wines with the food of the same region, a logic that evolved over centuries of people eating and drinking together in the same place. The classic pairing of Burgundy Pinot Noir with duck, or Chablis with oysters, or Sauternses with foie gras, these combinations weren't invented by sommeliers. They were arrived at slowly, by people who grew the food and made the wine in the same valley and simply noticed what tasted right together. The perception of sweetness in wine is influenced by far more than just the amount of residual sugar present. Acidity can make a wine taste drier than it actually is. A wine with high sugar but very high acidity can seem relatively austere, because the acidity counterbalances the sweetness on the palate. Tannins also suppress the perception of sweetness. This interplay is why tasting wine blind, without knowing anything about what's in the glass, is so humbling even for experts. The brain is working with multiple, sometimes contradictory signals simultaneously, and it's remarkably easy to be fooled. In one famous study, researchers at the University of Bordeaux gave wine students a white wine that had been dyed red with an odorless, flavorless colorant. The students, relying on what their eyes told them, almost universally described it using red wine vocabulary: dark fruit, tannin, structure. The color of a wine begins shaping our experience of it before we've even raised the glass to our lips. There is a word used in wine tasting, minerality, that describes a quality some wines possess of tasting almost stony or chalky, evoking wet slate, crushed gravel, or the smell of rain on dry stone. It's one of the most evocative and debated terms in the entire vocabulary of wine. For a long time it was assumed that this quality came directly from the minerals present in the soil, that a vine growing in chalky soil would produce a wine that tasted of chalk. The science, however, has largely complicated that picture. Mineral compounds in the soil don't actually transfer into the wine in any meaningful quantity. The true origin of that stony, mineral quality is still a subject of active research and genuine disagreement. Some researchers point to specific sulfur compounds produced during fermentation. Others suggest that low levels of certain organic acids are responsible. Whatever the mechanism, the sensation itself is real, and in wines like Chablis, Moselle Riesling, or Sansa, it can be one of the most beautiful and compelling things a glass of wine has to offer. Tasting wine attentively is, in many ways, a form of meditation. It asks you to slow down, to pay attention to what your senses are actually telling you, rather than what you expect them to say. And the more fluent you become in reading a glass, in recognizing that whisper of minerality, that grip of tannin, that lift of acidity, the more the wine begins to feel like a conversation rather than just a drink. A conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. Bubbles, sweetness, and the wines that broke the rules. Not all wine follows the same path. We've spent time in the quiet world of still wines, the reds and whites that rest in barrels and bottles, evolving slowly in the dark. But wine has other personalities entirely. There are wines that sparkle and dance in the glass. Wines of extraordinary sweetness, made from grapes that have been left to shrivel and concentrate on the vine, sometimes even encouraged to rot. Wines that have been fortified with spirits, transformed into something altogether different. These are the wines that broke the conventional rules, and in doing so, created some of the most beloved and fascinating bottles in the world. Champagne is arguably the most celebrated wine in the world, and its creation, at least in popular legend, is surrounded by one of wine's most enduring myths. The story goes that a 17th century monk named Dom Perignon discovered sparkling wine by accident and, upon tasting it for the first time, cried out to his fellow monks, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." It's a wonderful story. It's also almost certainly not true. Dom Perignon was a real person, a cellar master at the Abbey of Hautevillers in the Champagne region of France, but historical records suggest he actually spent much of his career trying to prevent his wines from sparkling, because the bubbles were considered a fault that caused bottles to explode unpredictably in the cellar. The romantic legend was largely invented by a 19th century champagne house as a marketing exercise. It worked so beautifully that it has outlasted virtually every other piece of wine mythology ever created. The bubbles in champagne and other traditional method sparkling wines are the result of a second fermentation that takes place inside the sealed bottle itself. After the base wine is made, a small, precisely calculated mixture of wine, sugar, and yeast, called the liqueur de tirage, is added before the bottle is sealed with a temporary cap. The yeast consumes the sugar, producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. Because the bottle is sealed, the carbon dioxide has nowhere to go. It dissolves into the wine under pressure. When the bottle is eventually opened, that pressure is released, and the dissolved gas escapes in the form of the fine, persistent bubbles we associate with great champagne. The entire process, from the addition of the tirage to the wine being ready for sale, takes a minimum of 15 months for non-vintage champagne and at least 3 years for vintage. The finest prestige cuvées are often aged for a decade or more before release. A standard bottle of champagne contains approximately 49 million bubbles, a figure calculated by researchers at the University of Reims, who clearly had their priorities exactly right. The size and persistence of those bubbles is considered a mark of quality. Finer, more persistent bubbles, rising in elegant, unbroken streams from the bottom of the glass, are associated with better wine and better glassware. Coarser, larger bubbles that dissipate quickly are a sign of either lower quality wine or a glass that hasn't been properly cleaned, since detergent residue and dust both affect the way bubbles form and behave. The technical term for bubble study, incidentally, is gaseodynamics, which is a word that deserves to be used far more often in everyday conversation. Prosecco, Cava, and Champagne are all sparkling wines, but they are made by fundamentally different methods and taste quite distinct from one another. Champagne, as we've discussed, undergoes its second fermentation inside the individual bottle. Cava, from Spain, uses the same method but with different grape varieties and a warmer climate, producing something slightly rounder and more approachable. Prosecco, from northeastern Italy, is made by a different method entirely. The second fermentation happens in large pressurized tanks rather than individual bottles, a process called the Charmat method or tank method. This is faster, less expensive, and produces a wine with softer, frothier bubbles and a fresher, more immediately fruity character. Neither method is inherently superior. they simply produce different styles of wine. Understanding the difference helps explain why Prosecco is light and easy drinking, while a great aged champagne carries a complexity and depth that takes years to develop. Some of the most extraordinary wines in the world are also the sweetest, and they come from a process that sounds, at first description, completely unappealing. Botrytis cinerea is a fungus that attacks grapes under specific conditions of morning mist followed by warm, dry afternoons. Left unchecked, it becomes grey rot, which simply destroys the fruit. But under the right conditions, it transforms into what winemakers call noble rot, and it does something remarkable. The fungus punctures the skin of the grape, allowing moisture to evaporate while concentrating the sugars, acids, and flavor compounds inside. The shriveled, gray-brown, thoroughly unappetizing-looking grapes that result produce wines of almost supernatural sweetness, complexity, and longevity. The great Sautenzas of Bordeaux, the Trockenbeerenese wines of Germany, and the Tokaji Asu of Hungary are all made from botrytis-affected grapes, and the finest examples can age for a century or more, evolving into something that barely resembles wine in the conventional sense at all. Hungary's Tokaji wine holds a place in history that few other wines can claim. For centuries, it was regarded as one of the greatest wines in the world, served at the courts of European royalty, praised by Voltaire, and reportedly described by King Louis XIV of France as the wine of kings, the king of wines. Tokaji Asu is made from those botrytis-affected grapes we just discussed, and its sweetness is measured in a unit called petonios, referring to the small hods traditionally used to carry the shriveled grapes through the vineyard. The higher the petonios number on the label, the sweeter and more concentrated the wine. Under communist rule in the 20th century, Hungary's wine industry was largely collectivized and quality collapsed. But since the 1990s, international investment and a new generation of passionate winemakers have been quietly restoring Tokaji to the heights it occupied 3 centuries ago. The comeback is one of the more quietly triumphant stories in the modern wine world. Port wine, from the Douro Valley in northern Portugal, is one of the world's great fortified wines, wines to which a neutral grape spirit has been added during fermentation, stopping the process before all the sugar has been converted to alcohol. The result is a wine that is simultaneously sweet, powerful, and extraordinarily long-lived. The Douro Valley is one of the most dramatic wine landscapes on Earth, steep, terraced hillsides of schist rock dropping toward a narrow river far below, the summer heat fierce and relentless. The grapes grown there, many of them ancient indigenous varieties with names virtually unknown outside Portugal, produce wines of remarkable intensity. Port comes in many styles, from the deep, ink-dark and tannic vintage port, which can age in bottle for 50 years or more, to the pale, nutty, oxidative tawny port, aged in small barrels for years or decades until it takes on that characteristic amber hue. Both are expressions of the same extraordinary landscape, arrived at by entirely different paths. Sherry, from the Jerez region in southern Spain, is perhaps the most misunderstood and underappreciated wine in the world. For decades, its reputation in many markets was dominated by cheap, sweet versions that bore little resemblance to the extraordinary range of wines that Jerez actually produces. True sherry ranges from bone-dry Fino and Manzanilla, among the most food-friendly and refreshing wines on earth, to the rich, complex, almost infinite depth of an aged Palo Cortadou or an ancient Amontoso. What makes sherry unique is the Solera system used to age and blend it, a cascade of barrels arranged in rows where older wine is progressively blended with younger wine over years and decades. The oldest sherries in a Solera system can contain traces of wine that are genuinely ancient. In some historic bodegas, traces of the original founding wine from over a century ago are still mathematically present in every bottle produced today. It's a form of continuity that exists in almost no other wine in the world. Ice wine, known as ice wine in Germany and ice wine in Canada, is one of the rarest and most labor-intensive wines in the world, produced from grapes that have been left on the vine until they freeze solid in the depths of winter. When frozen grapes are pressed, the water inside them remains as ice, and only the intensely sweet, concentrated juice, which has a lower freezing point, flows out. The resulting wine is extraordinarily rich and sweet, with a bright, piercing acidity that keeps it from becoming cloying. Producing it is a gamble of the highest order. The grapes must survive on the vine through autumn and into winter without rotting or being eaten by birds, and the harvest must happen at the precise moment of the freeze, often in the middle of the night in temperatures well below zero, with workers in thick gloves picking by lamplight in the dark. Canada's Niagara Peninsula and British Columbia have become world leaders in ice wine production, their reliably cold winters making them ideally suited to a style that requires temperatures that many traditional European regions can no longer consistently guarantee. Wine, it turns out, is not one thing at all. It is many things, still and sparkling, bone-dry and honeyed, light as morning and deep as time. Every style we've explored tonight is the result of someone, somewhere, noticing something unexpected, a frozen vine, a moldy grape, a bottle that wouldn't stop fizzing, and instead of discarding it, asking what might happen if they leaned in a little further. The most remarkable wines in the world were often born from exactly that kind of curious, patient attention. Time in a bottle, the art and science of aging wine. There is something almost philosophical about the idea of aging wine. You take something living, a bottle full of fermented grape juice, full of potential and energy, and you put it somewhere dark and still, and you simply wait. You resist the urge to open it. You trust that time is doing something you cannot see or measure, transforming what's inside into something that could not have existed any other way. It requires patience of a kind that feels almost countercultural in a world built on immediacy. And the wines that reward that patience are among the most astonishing things a human being can taste. The vast majority of wines produced in the world today are not made for aging. They are made to be drunk young, within a year or two of release, while their fruit is fresh and vivid and their character is at its most immediate and appealing. Only a relatively small proportion of wines genuinely benefit from extended time in the bottle, and understanding which wines those are is one of the more useful pieces of knowledge a wine lover can acquire. The wines most suited to long aging tend to share a set of structural characteristics: high acidity, significant tannins in the case of reds, high concentration of flavor compounds, and, in the case of sweet wines, high residual sugar. These elements act as preservatives, protecting the wine from oxidation and allowing it to evolve slowly rather than simply deteriorating. A wine that lacks these structural elements will not improve with age, it will simply fade. What actually happens inside a bottle of wine as it ages is a cascade of slow chemical reactions that scientists are still working to fully understand. In red wines, the tannins gradually polymerize. They link together into longer and longer chains, which makes them feel softer and silkier on the palate rather than grippy and astringent. The bright, primary fruit aromas of a young wine gradually give way to more complex tertiary aromas: dried fruits, leather, earthiness, tobacco, forest floor. The color of a red wine shifts from deep purple ruby through to garnet and eventually, in very old wines, to a pale brick or tawny at the rim. In white wines, the color deepens rather than fades, moving from pale straw through gold and eventually into deep amber in very old examples. The fresh, citrus-led aromas of a young white evolve into something richer and more complex: honey, beeswax, dried apricot, toasted nuts. The wine becomes, in a very real sense, a different drink from the one that was originally bottled. Every bottle of wine has what collectors and sommeliers call a drinking window, a period during which the wine is at or near its peak, offering the best possible expression of everything it has to offer. Before that window opens, the wine may be too young, its tannins too firm and its fruit too primary to show its full complexity. After that window closes, the wine has passed its peak and is in gentle, or sometimes rapid, decline. The challenge is that no one knows exactly when a wine's drinking window will open or close, because so much depends on how the wine has been stored, the specific character of that particular vintage, and the entirely subjective question of what the person drinking it is looking for. Some people prefer wines on the younger, more vigorous end of their window. Others prefer the contemplative complexity of a wine that has been open for decades. There is no single correct answer, and that ambiguity is part of what makes collecting and aging wine such an endlessly absorbing pursuit. The conditions in which wine is stored have an enormous impact on how it ages. Temperature is the most critical factor, Wine ages best at a cool, consistent temperature of around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Fluctuations in temperature are particularly damaging, causing the wine to expand and contract inside the bottle, which can gradually push the cork out or allow air to seep in. Humidity matters too. If the air around the bottles is too dry, natural corks can shrink and dry out, breaking their seal. This is why bottles are traditionally stored on their sides, keeping the wine in contact with the cork to prevent it from drying out. Light is another enemy. Ultraviolet radiation can trigger chemical reactions in wine that produce unpleasant flavors, which is partly why wine bottles are traditionally made from dark green or brown glass. And vibration, though its effects are subtler and more debated, is generally considered harmful to wine undergoing the slow, delicate chemical evolution of long aging. A great wine cellar, in other words, is essentially a place of profound stillness, dark, cool, quiet, and patient. Some wines have demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to survive the passage of time. In 2018, a bottle of 1774 Vin Jaune from the Jura region of France, a wine then 244 years old, was opened at a tasting event and reported to still be alive and drinkable, extraordinary as that seems. Vin Jaune is an unusual, oxidative style of wine that seems peculiarly resistant to the ravages of time. More famously, bottles from the legendary 1811 Chateau de Yquem vintage, a sweet Sautenzes, have been opened at various points over the past 2 centuries and found to be not merely surviving but genuinely extraordinary. The oldest commercially available wines in the world are typically Old Madeira, a fortified wine from the Portuguese island of the same name, where bottles from the early 1800s still occasionally surface at auction and are drunk with reverence and wonder. Wine made in the year of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, still alive, still speaking, still telling its story to anyone patient enough to listen. The wine auction market is one of the most fascinating and occasionally bewildering corners of the collecting world. Fine wine has, over the past 3 decades, established itself as a serious alternative asset class. Bottles of the right wines from the right vintages have consistently appreciated in value in ways that rival traditional investments. The most sought-after wines come from a relatively small number of producers in Burgundy, Bordeaux, and a handful of other prestige regions, and the prices they command at auction can be staggering. A single bottle of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, the most celebrated estate in Burgundy, from a great vintage can sell for tens of thousands of dollars. In 2018, a 1945 Romanée-Conti sold at Sotheby's for $558,000, a world record for a single bottle of wine at the time. The bottle contained approximately 750 milliliters of liquid. That works out to roughly $744 per milliliter, or around $22,000 per standard glass pour. Whether any wine, no matter how extraordinary, is worth that sum is a question each person must answer for themselves. Burgundy's extraordinary prices are driven not just by quality but by scarcity on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. The entire Domaine de la Romanée-Conti vineyard, whose wines are among the most expensive on earth, covers just 1.8 hectares. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of 2.5 American football fields. From that tiny plot, the domain produces somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 bottles per year in a typical vintage. Those bottles are allocated to a global network of importers, restaurants, and collectors, and by the time they reach the secondary market, if they reach it at all, the prices reflect not just the wine inside but the near impossibility of ever getting hold of it in the first place. Scarcity, as in so many areas of human desire, transforms a beautiful object into something approaching myth. Wine fraud is, unfortunately, as old as wine itself. The Romans were already adulterating their wines with honey, seawater, and various herbs and spices, partly for flavor, partly to disguise poor quality. In the modern era, the most audacious wine fraud in living memory was carried out by a man named Rudi Kurniawan, an Indonesian-born wine collector living in California who, over a period of years in the 2000s, fooled some of the most experienced palates in the world. Kurniawan created counterfeit bottles of rare and expensive Burgundy by relabeling bottles of less valuable wine with forged labels from prestigious producers and legendary vintages. He was meticulous, sourcing authentic old corks, recreating aged labels with extraordinary precision, and building a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable young collectors in America. He was eventually caught when he attempted to auction bottles of a wine from a vintage that the producer had never actually made. He was convicted of fraud in 2013 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The total value of the fake bottles he is believed to have sold runs into the tens of millions of dollars. The practice of laying wine down for future generations, buying wine not for yourself but for your children or even your grandchildren, is one of the most generous and optimistic things a wine lover can do. It is an act of faith that the future will come, that someone will be there to open the bottle, and that what's inside will have become something worth waiting for. In Bordeaux, it is traditional to buy wine en primeur as a futures contract before the wine has even finished aging, based on early barrel tastings. Buyers commit their money years before they receive their bottles, trusting that the quality suggested by those early samples will be fulfilled when the wine is finally released. It's a system that requires trust, patience, and a long view, qualities that wine, perhaps more than any other agricultural product, seems to quietly encourage in the people who love it. Time changes everything. A grape picked in autumn becomes something unrecognizable by the following spring. A bottle laid down in a cellar emerges years later wearing an entirely different face. Even the person who opens it will be different from the person who put it away, older, changed by their own seasons, bringing new experience and new understanding to what's in the glass. Wine ages. And in doing so, it reminds us, quietly and without drama, that so do we. The human story, visionaries, rebels, and the people who shaped wine. Every bottle of wine begins with a person. Behind the labels and the appellations and the centuries of tradition, there are human beings, patient, passionate, sometimes brilliant, occasionally stubborn to the point of legend, who decided to do things differently, or more carefully, or with a depth of attention that changed what everyone around them thought was possible. Wine history is full of these people. Their stories are as rich and varied as the wines they made. One of the most transformative figures in the history of wine wasn't a winemaker at all, he was a scientist. Louis Pasteur, the 19th century French chemist best known for developing pasteurization and the germ theory of disease, also turned his formidable attention to wine. At the request of Emperor Napoleon III, who was concerned about the quality and stability of French wines being exported overseas, Pasteur conducted a series of groundbreaking experiments in the 1860s that explained, for the first time, exactly what fermentation was and how it worked. Before Pasteur, winemakers knew that grape juice became wine, but they didn't understand why, and when things went wrong, they had no scientific framework for diagnosing or fixing the problem. Pasteur identified the role of yeast in fermentation, explained how oxygen affected wine for better and worse, and established the scientific foundations upon which all modern winemaking is built. The wine in every bottle produced today owes something, however indirectly, to a chemist who spent his evenings peering at grape juice through a microscope. The Rothschild family name is synonymous with wealth and influence in many fields, but their connection to wine is deeper and more passionate than many people realize. In 1853, Nathaniel de Rothschild purchased Chateau Braine-Mouton in Bordeaux and renamed it Chateau Mouton Rothschild. The following year, the famous 1855 classification of Bordeaux wines ranked Mouton as a second growth, a ranking that Nathaniel and his successors refused to accept as final. For over a century, successive generations of the family campaigned to have Mouton elevated to first growth status alongside the four most prestigious chateaux in Bordeaux. They adopted as their motto a phrase of magnificent, unapologetic confidence: Premier ne puis, second ne deign, Mouton sways, first I cannot be, second I do not deign to be, Mouton I am. In 1973, after more than 100 years of advocacy and a body of wines that had long since proved the point beyond reasonable argument, Mouton Rothschild was officially reclassified as a first growth, the only change ever made to the 1855 classification in its entire history. The motto was immediately updated: Premier je sways, second je fus, Mouton ne change, first I am, second I was, Mouton does not change. The natural wine movement, which has transformed parts of the wine world over the past 2 decades, owes its philosophical foundations largely to a small group of winemakers in France who began questioning the industrialization of wine production in the 1970s and 80s. Among the most influential was Jules Chauvet, a Beaujolais winemaker and biochemist who spent decades arguing that wine made with minimal intervention, no added sulfites, natural yeasts, no manipulation of the grape must, was both more honest and more interesting than the heavily managed wines increasingly common in commercial production. His ideas were considered eccentric at best and dangerously naive at worst by the mainstream wine establishment. But a new generation of winemakers, particularly in the Loire Valley and Beaujolais, took his philosophy and ran with it. Today, natural wine has its own festivals, its own bars, its own fiercely loyal community of drinkers, and a global influence that the wine establishment once dismissed as a passing fad has found itself unable to ignore. Robert Parker is a name that divides the wine world like almost no other. A former lawyer from Maryland with no formal wine training, Parker began publishing a wine newsletter in 1978 based on a simple, radical idea. Honest, independent reviews written for consumers rather than for the wine trade, with no advertising revenue and no financial ties to the producers being reviewed. His scoring system, rating wines on a 100-point scale, became the most influential critical tool in the history of the industry. A high Parker score could sell out an entire vintage overnight. A low score could devastate a chateau's reputation. At the height of his influence in the 1980s and 90s, Parker's palate, his particular love of rich, ripe, concentrated, full-bodied wines, was accused of pushing winemakers around the world to alter their style to match his preferences, homogenizing wine in pursuit of the perfect score. His defenders argued that he simply described what he found in the glass with fearless honesty. The debate about his legacy continues in wine circles to this day, but his impact on how the world buys, sells, and talks about wine is beyond question. Émile Peynaud was a French enologist, a wine scientist, whose work at the University of Bordeaux from the 1940s through the 1980s fundamentally changed how wine was made across the entire world. Where winemaking had previously been a craft passed down through families and shaped largely by tradition and intuition, Peynaud brought rigorous scientific analysis to every stage of the process. He identified the conditions that led to wine faults and taught winemakers how to prevent them. He championed the idea of harvesting grapes at optimal ripeness rather than according to fixed calendar dates. He introduced the concept of malolactic fermentation, a secondary bacterial process that converts sharp malic acid into softer lactic acid, as something to be managed and controlled rather than simply allowed to happen unpredictably. As a consultant, he worked with dozens of the most prestigious chateaux in Bordeaux, and the improvements in quality that Bordeaux experienced through the second half of the 20th century owe an enormous amount to his quiet, systematic influence. The story of wine in California cannot be told without the name Robert Mondavi, a figure of such energy, ambition, and occasionally difficult personality that his biography reads more like a novel than a business history. After a spectacular falling out with his family that reportedly ended with a physical altercation and his expulsion from the family winery, Mondavi founded his own eponymous winery in the Napa Valley in 1966 at the age of 53. Rather than simply making wine, he set out to prove that California could produce wines of world-class quality, and he did it with a missionary zeal, traveling to France, studying the great estates, bringing back ideas and techniques, and championing California wine to anyone who would listen. He was the first Napa producer to label his wine with the grape variety, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, rather than generic European place names like Burgundy or Chablis, a practice that became standard across the entire New World wine industry. Without Robert Mondavi's restless, combative, visionary energy, the Napa Valley as the world knows it today might never have existed. Women have shaped the history of wine in ways that are only now beginning to receive the recognition they deserve. Perhaps the most famous example is the widow Cliquot, Bob Nicole Cliquot Ponsardin, who took over her late husband's champagne house in 1805 at the age of 27, at a time when women in business were regarded with deep skepticism at best. Over the following decades, she transformed what was a modest regional producer into one of the most celebrated champagne houses in the world. Among her most significant contributions was the invention, or at least the perfection, of the riddling rack, a technology that solved one of the most persistent problems in champagne production: how to remove the sediment created by the second fermentation from inside the bottle without losing the wine. The puppeter she developed, which allows bottles to be gradually tilted and rotated until the sediment collects in the neck and can be removed, is still used by many traditional champagne houses today, more than 2 centuries later. The concept of the flying winemaker emerged in the 1980s and transformed wine production across the Southern Hemisphere and beyond. These were trained enologists, often Australian, often young, always energetic, who traveled between wineries across multiple continents, harvesting in the Northern Hemisphere in autumn and then flying south to catch the Southern Hemisphere harvest a few months later. They brought with them technical knowledge, modern equipment, and a pragmatic, results-oriented approach that was a world away from the tradition-bound conservatism of many European wine regions. Critics accused them of imposing a homogeneous, technically correct but characterless style on wines from Argentina to South Africa to southern France. Supporters argued that they raised the floor of quality dramatically in regions that had previously been plagued by poor winemaking and unnecessary faults. The truth, as usual, was somewhere between the two, but the flying winemakers undeniably changed what was possible and what was expected from wine regions that had previously been overlooked. Biodynamic farming, a philosophy of agriculture that goes considerably further than organic farming in its approach to the vineyard, was developed by the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner in the 1920s and has become one of the most talked about and debated practices in the modern wine world. Biodynamic viticulture treats the vineyard as a self-sustaining ecosystem, avoiding all synthetic chemicals and fertilizers, composting with specific herbal preparations, and, most controversially, timing vineyard and cellar work according to a lunar calendar that classifies days as fruit, flower, root, or leaf days, each supposedly more or less conducive to different viticultural tasks. The scientific evidence for the lunar calendar is, to put it politely, not robust. And yet some of the world's most celebrated and thoughtful winemakers, in Burgundy, in Alsace, in the Loire, in Germany, have adopted biodynamic practices and report healthier vines, more expressive wines, and a deeper connection to the land they farm. The debate between science and experience in this area is one of the most genuinely interesting in all of contemporary winemaking. Wine is made by human beings. And human beings, stubborn, brilliant, eccentric, passionate, occasionally wrong, and sometimes capable of changing everything, are what make the story of wine inexhaustible. Behind every label there is a person who decided to care deeply about what they were doing, who got up before dawn, walked through their vineyard in the cold, and asked themselves how to do it better than they did yesterday. That combination of humility and ambition is, perhaps, what great wine and great people have most in common. Wine and the body, health, science, and the chemistry of pleasure. Wine has been associated with health and medicine for almost as long as it has existed. The ancient Greeks used it as an antiseptic. Medieval physicians prescribed it for everything from digestive complaints to melancholy. And in the modern era, wine has been the subject of more scientific research, more headlines, more hope, and more controversy than perhaps any other beverage on earth. The truth, as it so often is, turns out to be more nuanced and more interesting than either the enthusiasts or the skeptics would have you believe. The relationship between wine and human health entered the modern scientific conversation in a dramatic way in 1991, when an American television program called 60 Minutes broadcast a segment exploring what became known as the French paradox. The puzzle was this: the French, despite eating a diet rich in saturated fats, butter, cream, cheese, foie gras, had significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease than Americans eating a less indulgent diet. The researcher at the center of the segment, Serge Renaud, suggested that regular, moderate consumption of red wine might be a significant factor in explaining the discrepancy. The broadcast caused an immediate and measurable spike in red wine sales across the United States, reportedly an overnight increase of 44%. It also triggered an explosion of scientific research into the health properties of wine that has continued, with varying and sometimes contradictory results, ever since. The French paradox itself has since been complicated by other researchers pointing to dietary patterns, genetics, and lifestyle factors as equally important variables. But it opened a conversation that fundamentally changed how the world thought about wine and health. Resveratrol is the compound that attracted the most scientific attention in the wake of the French paradox discussion, and for a period in the 1990s and 2000s it was treated in certain quarters almost as a wonder molecule. Found primarily in the skins of red grapes, and therefore present in red wine, resveratrol is a naturally occurring polyphenol that the grape plant produces as a defense against fungal infection and environmental stress. In laboratory studies on cells and animals, it demonstrated a remarkable range of potentially beneficial effects: anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and even, in some studies, apparent anti-cancer properties. The popular press embraced it with enormous enthusiasm. The reality, as the research has matured, is considerably more sobering. The concentrations of resveratrol required to produce the effects observed in laboratory settings are far higher than any amount achievable through drinking wine. A person would need to consume hundreds of glasses per day to approach the doses used in the most optimistic experiments. Resveratrol remains scientifically interesting, but it is not, as was briefly hoped, a magical ingredient that makes wine a health food. The concept of moderate drinking is central to most of the research suggesting potential health benefits from wine, and it is worth pausing on what moderate actually means in scientific terms, because it is considerably less than most people assume. Most researchers define moderate wine consumption as 1 standard drink per day for women and up to 2 for men, where a standard drink is approximately 150 milliliters, or a small glass. This is meaningfully less than a typical restaurant pour, which often runs to 175 or even 250 milliliters. The research suggesting cardiovascular benefits from wine has almost exclusively been conducted on people drinking within these modest limits. Beyond them, the risks of liver disease, certain cancers, dependency, and a range of other conditions begin to climb. The relationship between wine and health is not a simple linear one where more is better. It is, at the moderate end, genuinely complex and contested. At the excessive end, it is not complex at all. One of the most intriguing areas of wine science concerns not its chemical composition but its psychological and neurological effects, specifically, the way that expectation and context shape the experience of drinking it. A series of experiments conducted at the California Institute of Technology in the mid-2000s asked participants to taste wines they were told cost different amounts, some described as inexpensive, others as very costly. The wines were actually identical. Brain imaging conducted during the tasting showed that participants genuinely experienced more pleasure, measurable neurological activity in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, the region associated with experienced pleasantness, when they believed they were drinking the more expensive wine. The pleasure wasn't imagined or performed. It was neurologically real. Price, in other words, doesn't just change what we think about a wine. It changes what we actually feel when we drink it. This finding has profound and slightly unsettling implications for the entire culture of wine criticism, fine wine collecting, and the premium price tags attached to prestigious labels. The color of wine has been shown, in controlled experiments, to influence not just how we perceive its appearance but how we taste it, and even how we smell it. In one study, participants were asked to describe the aromas of a white wine served in a clear glass and then the same wine served in a black glass that concealed its color. Without the visual cue of the pale golden color, participants were significantly less likely to use white wine vocabulary, citrus, floral, fresh, and more likely to describe aromas associated with red wine. In a separate study, white wine dyed red was consistently described by trained tasters using red wine descriptors. Our brains, it turns out, do not process taste and smell in isolation. They integrate sensory information from every available channel simultaneously, and the visual channel is extraordinarily powerful. Drinking wine in complete darkness, as some avant-garde restaurants have experimented with, genuinely changes the experience, stripping away the visual context that normally shapes so much of what we think we're tasting. The question of why some people seem far more sensitive to wine's effects than others has been the subject of considerable scientific interest. Genetics plays a significant role. Variations in the genes encoding the enzymes responsible for metabolizing alcohol, particularly alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase, mean that different people process alcohol at different rates and produce different concentrations of acetaldehyde, the intermediate compound responsible for many of the unpleasant effects of drinking too much. A significant proportion of people of East Asian descent carry a variant of the aldehyde dehydrogenase gene that causes acetaldehyde to accumulate much more rapidly, producing the characteristic facial flushing and discomfort sometimes called Asian flush. This is not, as is sometimes suggested, simply a lower tolerance for alcohol. It is a specific genetic difference in the biochemistry of how the body processes it. Understanding your own genetic relationship with alcohol metabolism is, in a modest way, understanding something true and specific about your own body. Wine contains a compound called histamine, produced during malolactic fermentation by lactic acid bacteria, and histamines are well established as triggers for certain types of headaches and allergic responses in people who are sensitive to them. Red wines generally contain higher levels of histamine than white wines, which may partly explain why some people find that red wine gives them headaches even after a modest amount. However, the picture is complicated by the fact that many foods contain considerably higher concentrations of histamine than wine, aged cheese, cured meats, fermented foods, without producing the same reported response. Some researchers suggest that wine may contain other compounds that inhibit the enzyme responsible for breaking down histamine, effectively amplifying its effects beyond what the concentration alone would predict. The science of wine headaches remains genuinely unresolved, and anyone who tells you they have a definitive explanation is probably overstating the current state of the evidence. The act of sharing wine has been shown in social psychology research to have measurable effects on group cohesion and trust. Studies examining communal drinking, where a group shares wine poured from the same bottle into individual glasses versus individuals drinking from separate personal bottles, found that shared drinking increased feelings of connection, cooperation, and mutual trust among the participants. The effect appeared to be at least partly independent of the alcohol itself, suggesting that the ritual of sharing, the act of pouring for one another, of drinking from a common source, carries its own social significance beyond mere intoxication. This perhaps shouldn't surprise us. Wine has been at the center of human ritual and communal life for 8,000 years. The impulse to open a bottle and share it with people you care about is not merely a social habit. It is, in some deep sense, an expression of something genuinely and specifically human. The emerging field of wine and the microbiome is one of the most fascinating and genuinely promising areas of current research. The gut microbiome, the vast ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms living in the human digestive system, is increasingly understood to play a profound role in overall health, influencing everything from immune function to mental health to metabolic processes. Some researchers have begun investigating whether the polyphenols in wine, the broad class of plant compounds that includes resveratrol, tannins, and many others, might act as prebiotics, selectively feeding beneficial strains of gut bacteria. Early results in some studies have been intriguing, suggesting that moderate red wine consumption may be associated with greater microbiome diversity, which is generally considered a marker of better gut health. The research is early and the conclusions are preliminary. But the possibility that the health story of wine might ultimately be told not in terms of a single miracle molecule but in terms of a complex interaction with the ecosystem of the human gut is, to say the least, a compelling direction for science to be heading. The science of wine and health is, like wine itself, complex, evolving, and resistant to simple conclusions. It rewards patience, nuance, and a willingness to hold uncertainty comfortably rather than reaching for easy answers. What it does suggest, consistently and across many different lines of research, is that wine is not simply a delivery mechanism for alcohol, it is a chemically extraordinary liquid whose relationship with the human body is still being mapped, still being understood, and still capable of surprising the scientists who study it most carefully. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what great wine does to the people who drink it. the forgotten and the unexpected, wine cultures the world overlooks. The world of wine is far larger and stranger and more varied than the familiar names on restaurant wine lists would suggest. For every Bordeaux and Barolo and Napa Cabernet, there are dozens of wine cultures quietly going about their business in corners of the world that the mainstream wine conversation rarely reaches. Ancient traditions that predate the French appellation system by thousands of years, emerging regions producing wines of startling originality, and places where the very definition of what wine is and how it should be made looks completely different from anything we've discussed so far. Let's take a slow, curious journey through some of them. We began this story in Georgia, with those 8,000-year-old clay jars, and it's worth returning there, because Georgia isn't merely a footnote in wine history. It is one of the most alive and extraordinary wine cultures in the world today, producing wines in ways that have remained essentially unchanged for millennia. The qvevri, those large, egg-shaped clay vessels we mentioned at the very beginning, are still used by Georgian winemakers to ferment and age their wines. The grapes, including skins, seeds, and stems, are placed inside and left to ferment naturally, with the grape solids remaining in contact with the juice for months, sometimes the entire winter. The result is what the rest of the world has come to call orange wine, white wine made with the extended skin contact normally associated with red wine production, giving it a deep amber color, a tannic structure, and a complexity of flavor that is entirely unlike any other style of white wine on earth. Georgia produces over 500 indigenous grape varieties, many of them unknown outside the country's borders. The diversity, the antiquity, and the sheer strangeness of Georgian wine is extraordinary, a living museum of what wine was before the modern world arrived. Greece is another ancient wine culture whose modern wines remain far less celebrated than they deserve. Greece has been making wine continuously for at least 3,500 years. Its wines are mentioned in Homer, celebrated in the writings of Plato, and were among the most sought after in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks typically diluted their wine with seawater or fresh water, considering it barbaric to drink it undiluted, a custom that says something interesting about the likely strength and concentration of ancient Greek wines. Today, Greece is home to around 300 indigenous grape varieties, most of them virtually unknown outside the country. Assyrtiko, grown on the volcanic island of Santorini in ancient, basket-shaped vines that crouch close to the ground to protect themselves from the fierce Aegean winds, produces white wines of extraordinary minerality and precision. Xinomavro, grown in the northern region of Naousa, makes red wines of such complexity and age-worthiness that serious wine lovers have begun comparing them, in structure if not in flavor, to the great wines of Burgundy and Barolo. Greece is, for those paying attention, one of the most exciting wine countries in the world. Lebanon's Bekaa Valley is one of the most improbable fine wine regions on earth, and one of the most moving. Situated at altitude between two mountain ranges, the valley has been producing wine since Phoenician times, making it among the oldest continuously farmed wine regions in the world. The modern Lebanese wine industry was largely founded by a single estate, Chateau Musa, whose founder Serge Hocker continued making wine through 15 years of civil war, including a vintage in 1984 during which the winery was shelled. Hocker famously said that the only vintages he missed during the entire conflict were 1976 and 1984, years when the fighting made it physically impossible to get the grapes from the vineyard to the winery. Chateau Musa produces wines of a style unlike anything else, blends of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cinsault, and Carignan that age for extraordinary periods and develop a complexity and originality that has earned them devoted admirers around the world. That wines of such beauty continue to be made in conditions of such difficulty is, in its own quiet way, one of the most remarkable stories in all of wine. England is not a country most people associate with fine wine, and yet English sparkling wine has, over the past 2 decades, emerged as one of the most genuinely exciting and critically acclaimed wine styles in the world. The chalky soils of southern England, particularly in Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire, are geologically almost identical to the chalk of the Champagne region in northern France, and the cool maritime climate produces grapes with the high natural acidity that is the essential foundation of great sparkling wine. English producers, working primarily with the same 3 grape varieties used in Champagne, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, have been producing sparkling wines that have beaten their French counterparts in blind tastings with increasing regularity. In 2017, a systematic blind tasting organized by a leading wine publication placed English sparkling wines above champagne in multiple categories. The irony of a country whose wine reputation was, for most of its history, a source of gentle mockery now producing sparkling wines that embarrass the most prestigious region in France is one that the English, characteristically, are enjoying enormously. Japan's wine culture is ancient in its appreciation but young in its production, and it is producing results that are beginning to turn heads internationally. The Japanese grape variety Koshu has been grown in the Yamanashi prefecture at the foot of Mount Fuji for over 1,000 years, having arrived, it is believed, along the Silk Road from Central Asia. For most of that time it was eaten as a table grape. It was only in the 20th century that Japanese winemakers began taking it seriously as a wine grape, and what they discovered was a variety of enormous delicacy and subtlety, producing pale, elegant white wines with gentle citrus and floral notes and a refinement that seems to embody something deeply Japanese in its aesthetic sensibility. Japanese winemakers have also embraced European varieties with characteristic precision and dedication, and the quality of wines emerging from Hokkaido in the north and Nagano in the central mountains has been quietly impressing international critics who expected to be politely underwhelmed and found themselves genuinely moved. The wine culture of China is ancient. Records of winemaking date back over 2,000 years, but the modern Chinese wine industry is one of the fastest growing and most dramatic transformations in the global wine world. China is now one of the largest wine-consuming nations on earth, and its domestic wine production has expanded at a pace that would have seemed impossible 2 decades ago. The most extraordinary development has been in the Ningxia region in northwestern China, a high-altitude desert at the foot of the Helan Mountains, where an unlikely combination of intense sunshine, cold winters, and mineral-rich soils has produced conditions surprisingly well-suited to viticulture. Ningxia wines, made primarily from Cabernet Sauvignon and other international varieties, have won medals at international competitions and attracted investment and attention from around the world. The vines must be buried under earth each winter to protect them from temperatures that can drop to -20 degrees, a labor-intensive practice that adds an extraordinary dimension to every harvest. China's wine story is barely begun, and its next chapter is one of the most intriguing unknowns in the entire industry. The wines of the Canary Islands occupy a place in history considerably more significant than their modest current reputation suggests. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Canary wine, produced on the volcanic islands off the northwest coast of Africa, was among the most celebrated and expensive in the world. Shakespeare mentioned it. It was the preferred wine of the English court. Ships stopped at the Canaries specifically to load barrels of it. The wine fell from fashion over the following centuries, and the island's wine industry dwindled into near obscurity. But something remarkable survived: ancient vines. Because the islands were never reached by phylloxera, the devastating vine louse that destroyed most of Europe's vineyards in the 19th century, the Canary Islands are home to pre-phylloxera vines of extraordinary age, some of them several centuries old, growing in black volcanic ash in ways that look unlike any other vineyard on earth. The wines they produce, particularly from the Liston Negro and Liston Blanco varieties, are unlike anything grown anywhere else, carrying in them something of the volcanic earth and the ancient Atlantic winds, and something else, harder to name, that speaks of survival across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Austria is a country whose wines remain criminally underappreciated outside of a relatively small circle of devoted enthusiasts, partly because of a scandal that, while resolved decades ago, cast a long shadow. In 1985, it emerged that a small number of Austrian wine producers had been adulterating their wines with diethylene glycol, a compound used in antifreeze, to give them a sweeter, fuller body. The scandal was not dangerous in the concentrations used, but it was deeply damaging to Austria's wine reputation internationally, and the country spent years rebuilding trust. What emerged from that rebuilding was one of the most rigorously regulated and quality-focused wine industries in the world. Austria's great white wine, Grüner Veltliner, a variety grown virtually nowhere else, produces wines of a distinctive character, dry, peppery, refreshing, and food-friendly in a way that is entirely its own. And Austria's Rieslings, grown on steep terraces above the Danube in the Wachau region, are considered by many experts to be among the finest expressions of the variety anywhere in the world. From a scandal, improbably, came excellence. The island of Madeira, a Portuguese archipelago in the Atlantic Ocean, produces what is almost certainly the most indestructible wine in the world. Madeira wine is deliberately subjected during production to a process called estufagem, either heating the wine in large tanks for a minimum of 3 months, or aging it slowly in barrels in warm attic rooms called canteros for years or decades. This deliberate oxidation and heat treatment, which would destroy virtually any other wine, actually stabilizes Madeira in a way that makes it essentially immortal. Once a bottle of Madeira is opened, it can be kept for months without deteriorating, a property unmatched by any other wine. And in the bottle, Madeira ages not merely gracefully but triumphantly, with bottles from the 1800s still drinking magnificently. The reason Madeira developed this extraordinary character is partly historical accident. The island was a provisioning stop for ships crossing the Atlantic, and it was noticed that wine carried on those long, hot voyages, repeatedly crossing the equator, arrived transformed into something richer and more complex than it had been when it left. In trying to replicate that transformation on land, the winemakers of Madeira accidentally created a wine that time itself cannot destroy. The world of wine extends far beyond the familiar map. In volcanic ash and ancient clay, in the shadow of mountains and beside rivers whose names most people couldn't find on a globe, human beings have been making wine, patiently, passionately, with local grapes and local traditions and a relationship to the land that in some cases stretches back further than recorded history. Every one of those bottles carries a world inside it. Most of them, most of the time, nobody outside that world will ever know. But they exist. And that, somehow, feels important. The future in the glass, where wine is going next. We've traveled a long way together. From those ancient clay jars buried in the Georgian earth 8,000 years ago, through the vineyards of Rome and the monastery cellars of medieval France, through the science of fermentation and the art of tasting, through the stories of the people who changed everything and the forgotten wine cultures that have been quietly extraordinary all along. Now, as we approach the end of our journey, it feels right to turn and look forward, toward the future that wine is moving into, and the questions that future is beginning to ask. Because wine, like everything alive, is changing. And the changes coming are among the most significant in its entire history. Climate change is already reshaping the wine world in ways that are simultaneously fascinating and deeply concerning. Average temperatures in many of Europe's classic wine regions have risen by more than 1 degree Celsius over the past 50 years, a change that sounds modest but has profound effects on viticulture. Grapes are ripening earlier than at any point in recorded history. In Bordeaux, the average harvest date has moved forward by almost 2 weeks compared to the mid-20th century. In Burgundy, researchers comparing current harvest records with historical archives dating back to the 14th century found that the 10 earliest harvests ever recorded all occurred after the year 2000. Warmer temperatures mean riper grapes, which means higher sugar levels, which means higher alcohol in the finished wine. Wines that once sat comfortably at 12 or 13% alcohol now routinely reach 14, 15, even 16%. The character of the wines is changing with them. The cool climate, elegance and restraint that defined the classic style of many European regions is becoming harder and harder to achieve. As temperatures rise in traditional wine regions, they are simultaneously opening up possibilities in places that were previously considered too cold to grow wine grapes. England, as we've already discussed, has emerged as a serious sparkling wine producer. But the changes extend much further north and east than that. Denmark, Sweden, and even parts of Norway are now producing wine commercially, something that would have seemed absurd as recently as the 1980s. In Canada, regions beyond the established wine areas of British Columbia and Ontario are beginning to attract viticultural interest. In the Southern Hemisphere, the cool southern reaches of New Zealand's South Island and the high-altitude regions of Patagonia in Argentina are being explored with increasing seriousness. Climate change is, in the most uncomfortable possible way, simultaneously threatening the wine regions we love and creating the wine regions of the future. Some of the most venerable wine regions in the world are already experimenting with solutions to the warming climate that would have been considered heretical a generation ago. In Burgundy, a region so attached to its specific grape varieties that the idea of planting anything other than Pinot Noir and Chardonnay was essentially unthinkable, the governing body has recently approved a small number of heat-tolerant alternative varieties that may be used in blends as temperatures continue to rise. In Bordeaux, similar discussions are underway about introducing varieties that retain their acidity better in warm conditions. In Spain and southern Italy, winemakers are moving their vineyards to higher altitudes, where cooler temperatures partly compensate for the warming climate. The tension between tradition and adaptation, between preserving what makes these regions unique and accepting that the conditions which created that uniqueness are changing, is one of the most profound challenges the wine world has ever faced. Technology is entering the vineyard in ways that previous generations of winemakers could not have imagined. Precision viticulture, using satellite imaging, drone surveillance, and soil sensors to monitor individual vine health, water stress, and ripeness levels across an entire vineyard simultaneously, is allowing winemakers to make decisions with a granularity and accuracy that was previously impossible. Vineyards that once had to be treated as single units are now being managed vine by vine, with different rows harvested at different times based on real-time data about ripeness. Some wineries are experimenting with artificial intelligence systems that analyze decades of vintage data alongside current weather patterns to predict optimal harvest windows and suggest cellar interventions. The romantic image of the winemaker walking the vineyard and tasting a grape to know when to pick is not disappearing, but it is being supplemented by a layer of analytical precision that is changing what's possible. The question of what wine will taste like in 50 or 100 years is one that researchers and winemakers are beginning to think about with some urgency. As the varieties that define the classic wine region struggle with warming temperatures, geneticists and plant scientists are working to understand the full genetic diversity of the wine grape family, including those thousands of obscure, ancient varieties that have survived in remote corners of Georgia, Greece, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. Some of these varieties, which evolved in warmer, drier conditions over thousands of years, may carry genetic traits, heat tolerance, drought resistance, the ability to retain acidity at high temperatures that could be invaluable in a warming world. The grape varieties that seem irrelevant today, the ones grown only by a single elderly farmer in a remote valley, might turn out to be precisely what the wine world needs a century from now. Preserving them is not nostalgia. It is insurance. The rise of organic and biodynamic viticulture, farming without synthetic pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers, has been one of the most significant trends in the wine world over the past 2 decades, and it shows every sign of continuing to accelerate. The proportion of vineyards farmed organically has grown dramatically across Europe, driven partly by consumer demand, partly by a growing body of evidence that chemically intensive farming degrades soil health over time, and partly by the passionate advocacy of winemakers who have watched the living ecosystem of their vineyards respond positively to more natural management. Healthy soil, rich in microorganisms, earthworms, and fungal networks, is increasingly understood to be the foundation of wine quality rather than simply the medium through which synthetic inputs are delivered. The shift is not without its challenges. Organic and biodynamic farming is more labor-intensive, less predictable, and more vulnerable to disease pressure. But the direction of travel, both in the vineyard and in the market, seems increasingly clear. Perhaps one of the most quietly revolutionary developments in contemporary winemaking is happening not in famous chateaux or celebrated appellations but in small urban wineries, often in industrial units on the edges of cities, where a new generation of winemakers is approaching wine with a freedom from tradition that is producing some of the most original and challenging bottles being made anywhere in the world. These producers, sometimes called urban winemakers or simply part of the broader natural wine movement, are sourcing grapes from unexpected places, working with varieties nobody has heard of, fermenting in concrete eggs and amphorae and old pickle barrels, making wines that are cloudy, funky, fizzing with life, and deliberately, joyfully unlike anything a classical wine education would prepare you for. They are polarizing figures in the wine world. Their wines confound some drinkers and thrill others. But they are asking important questions about what wine is allowed to be, and the best of them are producing answers that are genuinely, surprisingly beautiful. The global wine market is undergoing a generational shift in who is drinking wine and how they think about it. For decades, the fine wine world was shaped predominantly by an older, largely male demographic with a reverence for established names and traditional hierarchies. The generation now coming of age as wine drinkers is approaching it differently, more curious about unusual varieties and unfamiliar regions, more interested in the story behind the bottle than the prestige of the label, more comfortable with the idea that a $12 wine from a grape nobody has heard of grown in a country not known for wine might be more interesting than a famous name from a celebrated vintage. This shift is already changing which wines get attention, which producers get discovered, and what qualities wine lovers look for in a glass. The wine world is, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, becoming more democratic. The gatekeepers are losing their gates. Wine has found its way into space, literally. In November 2019, 12 bottles of Bordeaux red wine were sent to the International Space Station as part of a scientific experiment conducted by a Luxembourg-based startup called Space Cargo Unlimited. The bottles spent 14 months in orbit, experiencing microgravity, cosmic radiation, and temperature fluctuations before returning to Earth in January 2021. When the wine was analyzed and tasted by a panel of experts, they reported measurable differences in its chemical composition and sensory character compared to identical bottles that had remained on Earth. The molecules in the space wine had evolved differently, the tannins had polymerized in a distinct way, and the aromatic profile had shifted noticeably. What the experiment ultimately means for winemaking is still being studied. But the image of 12 bottles of Bordeaux drifting silently above the Earth, slowly and mysteriously changing inside their glass, while the planet turns below them, that image seems, somehow, entirely consistent with the strange and wonderful nature of wine itself. The world's wine regions are mapped today with extraordinary precision, every appellation defined, every boundary drawn, every classification established. And yet the map is not finished. New wine regions are being formally recognized and developed all the time, in places that the traditional wine world has barely begun to pay attention to. India has a small but growing wine industry centered around Nashik in Maharashtra, producing wines that are finding export markets for the first time. Uruguay's Tannat, a grape so tannic and fierce that it largely disappeared from its native southwest France, has found a second home on the South American plains, producing wines of character and depth that are only now beginning to reach international audiences. Mexico's Valle de Guadalupe in Baja California is producing wines of genuine distinction. Ethiopia, with its ancient wild vines and high-altitude vineyard sites, is a country some researchers believe may be capable of producing wines of real quality given time, investment, and attention. The edges of the wine map are still being drawn. Artificial intelligence is beginning to be applied not just to viticulture but to wine analysis and recommendation in ways that raise interesting questions about the future of expertise and taste. Machine learning systems trained on vast datasets of wine reviews, chemical analyses, and consumer preference data are becoming increasingly adept at predicting which wines a given drinker will enjoy, identifying wine faults, and even estimating the likely quality and longevity of a wine based on its chemical profile alone. In 2017, a study published in a peer-reviewed journal reported that a machine learning algorithm was able to identify the vintage of a wine from its chemical composition with a high degree of accuracy, a task that even experienced sommeliers find genuinely difficult. Whether artificial intelligence will ever replace the human experience of tasting and appreciating wine, the irreducibly personal, emotional, memory-laden quality of what happens when a particular wine meets a particular person at a particular moment in their life, seems unlikely. But it will change the landscape of expertise around it in ways we are only beginning to understand. The language we use to describe wine has expanded enormously over the past century, and it continues to evolve. The professional vocabulary of wine tasting, with its references to black currants and pencil shavings, to violets and wet slate, to the texture of silk or the weight of velvet, can seem impenetrable or even absurd to newcomers. And yet there is a genuine purpose behind it. In trying to articulate the inarticulable, the specific, fleeting, deeply personal experience of tasting something complex, wine language is attempting one of the hardest things human communication can do: put into words something that lives entirely in the senses. The best wine writing does something that great poetry does. It makes you taste something you haven't tasted yet, or remember something you had forgotten, or reach for a glass and think, yes, that is exactly it. Language and wine have been companions for as long as both have existed, and the conversation between them is nowhere near finished. The relationship between wine and memory is one of the most scientifically fascinating and personally resonant aspects of drinking it. Smell is the sense most directly connected to the brain's limbic system, the region associated with emotion and memory, which means that the aromas of wine have a unique capacity to trigger vivid, emotionally charged recollections in a way that other sensory experiences rarely match. A single sniff of a particular wine can transport a person back decades, to a specific evening, a specific table, a specific face across the candlelight. This is not imagination or nostalgia, it is neurology. The olfactory system has a more direct anatomical pathway to the memory centers of the brain than any other sense. It is why the experience of opening a bottle you last tasted 20 years ago can feel less like drinking wine and more like time travel. And it is perhaps the deepest explanation of why wine matters to people in a way that goes far beyond the pleasure of the drink itself. Wine has inspired more poetry, more painting, more literature, and more music than perhaps any other physical object in human history. From the wine-dark sea of Homer's Odyssey to the vineyards of Keats and Baudelaire, from the still-life paintings of the Dutch masters to the wine-soaked novels of Hemingway and the philosophical dialogues of Plato conducted over shared cups, wine has served as a lens through which human beings examine some of their deepest preoccupations: pleasure and excess, time and mortality, beauty and transience, the relationship between the natural world and the human spirit. There is something about wine, its combination of simplicity and complexity, its capacity to change over time, its dependence on place and season and the skill of human hands, that seems to speak directly to the things we find most difficult and most important to put into words. The ritual of opening a bottle of wine, the cutting of the foil, the slow extraction of the cork, the first pour, the first smell, is one of the small ceremonies of everyday life that connects us to something much larger than the occasion itself. These rituals are not accidental. They evolved over centuries precisely because they work, because the act of slowing down, of attending to something with care, of sharing the moment of opening with the people around you, enhances what follows. Every wine culture in the world, from the most ancient to the most contemporary, has its rituals around wine. The specific gestures differ. The underlying impulse, to mark a moment, to bring people together, to say that this time and these people and this shared experience matter, is universal. There are currently approximately 7.4 million hectares of vineyards planted around the world, a number that covers an area roughly the size of Ireland. Those vineyards exist on every continent except Antarctica, in countries as climatically diverse as Canada and Morocco, Ethiopia and New Zealand, India and Sweden. They are farmed by millions of people, many of them small, family-owned operations working land that has been in the same family for generations. The scale of the global wine industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, can make it easy to forget that at its heart, wine is an agricultural product made by people working with soil and weather and plants, dependent on the generosity of each particular year's climate, vulnerable to frost and drought and hail in ways that no industrial process can fully protect against. Every bottle of wine is, in the most fundamental sense, a negotiation between human skill and natural force. The oldest wine cellar ever discovered archaeologically was found in 2013 at a site called Tel Kabri in northern Israel, dating back approximately 3,700 years. The cellar contained the remains of around 40 large storage jars, and chemical analysis revealed traces of wine mixed with honey, mint, cinnamon, juniper berries, and various resins, suggesting that the ancient Canaanites who made it were producing a sophisticated, flavored wine that would not have seemed out of place in a contemporary craft drinks menu. The cellar was large enough and well enough organized to suggest a significant scale of production. This was not a private collection but something closer to a commercial operation. 3,700 years of human beings making wine, refining it, flavoring it, storing it carefully, and sharing it with one another. The continuity of that impulse across such an expanse of time is, when you sit with it for a moment, genuinely astonishing. Wine is one of the very few agricultural products in the world that improves, or can improve, with time after it leaves the hands of the people who made it. Almost everything we eat and drink is at its best as close to its creation as possible. Bread from the oven, vegetables from the garden, fish from the sea. Wine alone has the capacity to continue evolving, developing, deepening in the bottle for years and decades after the winemaker has finished their work. This means that a winemaker planting a vine today is making something that may not reach its full expression until decades after they are gone. There is a particular kind of generosity in that, a willingness to work for a future you may not live to see, to put something into the world whose final form will be shaped by time rather than by you. Of all the qualities that make wine extraordinary, that quality of patient, hopeful, generous futurity may be the most quietly profound. And finally, perhaps the most important fact of all, and the one that underlies every other fact we've explored tonight. Wine is, at its most essential, a connection. A connection between the earth and the sky, between the vine and the hand that tends it, between the winemaker and the person who eventually opens the bottle. A connection between the past, those ancient Georgians pressing grapes into clay 8,000 years ago, and the present and the future. A connection between the people sitting around the table when the bottle is opened, sharing something that took years, sometimes decades, to become itself. Wine does not need to be expensive or rare or critically acclaimed to do this. A simple, honest bottle of something local, shared with people you love, on an ordinary evening that becomes, because of the sharing, something more than ordinary, that is the whole story. That has always been the whole story. Every other fact leads back to this one. We've come a long way since that first fact. From the ancient vineyards of Georgia to the space station drifting above us. From the monks of Burgundy measuring their plots with a patience that spanned generations, to the young winemakers in urban cellars making something entirely their own. From the chemistry of fermentation to the neuroscience of memory. From the miracle of a grape ripening in volcanic ash on a remote Atlantic island, to the simple, irreplaceable ritual of pouring a glass for someone you care about. 100 facts. And yet the truth is that wine is not really a subject that facts can exhaust. For everything we've told you tonight, there are 100 more things we haven't touched, 1,000 more bottles we haven't opened, 1,000 more stories we haven't told, 1,000 more vineyards we haven't walked through in the early morning with the mist still sitting low between the rows. That inexhaustibility is part of what makes wine worth a lifetime of attention. It rewards curiosity without ever fully satisfying it. It offers complexity without demanding that you master it. It asks only that you slow down, pay attention, and remain open to being surprised. So wherever you are right now, whether there's a glass in your hand or simply the memory of one, we hope this journey has given you something. A new way of looking at what's in the glass. A deeper appreciation for the extraordinary chain of events, geological, biological, historical, human, that had to unfold over thousands of years for any bottle of wine to exist at all. Wine is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever told. And it's still being written, in every vineyard, every cellar, every harvest, every bottle laid carefully down in the dark to wait for a future that hasn't arrived yet. Thank you for spending this time with us. Now, perhaps, if you haven't already, go and open something you love.